I never thought finding a roommate could lead to such a nightmare. It all started when I moved to the city for my new job. Rent was sky high, so I posted an ad looking for someone to share expenses. That's when I met Sarah. At first, Sarah seemed like the perfect roommate. She was always smiling, eager to help around the apartment, and even offered to cook dinner most nights. I thought I'd hit the jackpot. We'd stay up late, sharing stories and laughing over glasses of wine. It felt like I'd known her for years. But as the weeks passed, I started noticing little things that made me uneasy. Sarah began dressing like me, copying my hairstyle, and even mimicking my mannerisms. At first, I brushed it off as flattery, but it soon became unsettling. One night, I came home to find Sarah wearing one of my favorite outfits, without asking. When I confronted her, she just smiled and said, "Oh, I thought we were close enough to share clothes now. We're practically sisters, aren't we?" That's when I realized how much Sarah had inserted herself into my life. She knew my work schedule by heart, always seemed to be around when I had plans with friends, and even started using the same brands of makeup and perfume as me. It was like living with my own creepy doppelganger. I tried to create some boundaries, but Sarah didn't take it well. Her smile became forced, her eyes cold. I started to feel like a prisoner in my own home, constantly watched and judged. Little did I know, the worst was yet to come. Things escalated quickly after that. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find Sarah standing in my doorway just watching me sleep. She'd claimed she heard a noise and was checking on me, but her eyes told a different story. I started locking my bedroom door, but that only seemed to agitate her more. She'd bang on it at odd hours, claiming she needed to talk urgently. When I'd open up, it was always something trivial. My friends started to notice Sarah's odd behavior too. She'd insert herself into our conversations, finishing my sentences and acting like we were inseparable. When I tried to go out alone, she'd guilt-trip me, saying things like, "I thought we were best friends. Don't you want me around?" I began to feel suffocated, constantly walking on eggshells in my own home. Sarah's mood swings became more frequent and intense. One moment she'd be laughing and joking, the next she'd be cold and distant, accusing me of betraying her trust. I decided to do some digging into Sarah's past, hoping to understand what was driving her behavior. What I found chilled me to the bone. Sarah had a history of obsessive relationships, restraining orders, and even a stint in a psychiatric facility. How had I missed all the red flags? As I sat there, staring at my computer screen in disbelief, I heard Sarah's key in the lock. My heart raced as I quickly closed the tabs and tried to act normal. But as she walked in, I could see in her eyes that she knew something had changed. The air grew thick with tension, and I realized I was trapped with a potentially dangerous person. The next few days were a twisted game of cat and mouse. I tried to act normal while planning my escape, but Sarah seemed to sense my intentions. She became clingy, hardly letting me out of her sight. When I had to go to work, she'd text me constantly, demanding to know my whereabouts. One evening, I returned home to find Sarah had redecorated my room to match hers exactly. "Now we're truly sisters," she said, her eyes gleaming with an unsettling intensity. I felt sick to my stomach but forced a smile, knowing I had to play along until I could safely get away. I confided in my best friend Lisa about the situation. We made plans for me to move out while Sarah was at work, but somehow Sarah found out. The night before my planned escape, she confronted me, her face contorted with rage and hurt. "You can't leave me," she screamed, grabbing my arms. "We're supposed to be together forever." I managed to break free and lock myself in the bathroom, my heart pounding as Sarah pounded on the door, alternating between threats and tearful pleas. Through the door, I heard her rummaging in the kitchen. The clinking of metal sent a chill down my spine. Was she grabbing a knife? I frantically texted Lisa for help, praying she'd arrive before Sarah could break through. As Sarah's assault on the door intensified, I could hear the wood splintering. I looked around desperately for a weapon, anything to defend myself. The bathroom window was too small to escape through. I was trapped, with a madwoman just seconds away from breaking in. Just as the door began to give way, I heard a loud crash from the living room. Lisa had arrived with the police. Sarah's attack on the door stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of a scuffle and Sarah's hysterical screams. When I finally emerged, shaking from the bathroom, I saw Sarah being restrained by two officers. She locked eyes with me, her gaze a mix of betrayal and manic devotion. "We were supposed to be together forever," she said, her voice eerily calm now. "You'll see. This isn't over." The next few weeks were a blur of police statements, restraining orders, and therapy sessions. I moved in with Lisa temporarily, too traumatized to live alone. But Sarah's words haunted me. Was it really over? I thought I was paranoid when I started noticing a familiar figure in the crowd, always just at the edge of my vision. But then the notes started appearing, on my car, slipped under Lisa's door, even at my workplace. All with the same message: sisters forever. The police said they couldn't do anything unless Sarah directly threatened me. I felt helpless, constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every sound. My life had become a waking nightmare. One night, I woke up to a strange smell. Smoke was seeping under my bedroom door. In a panic, I ran to the window, only to see Sarah standing in the yard below, a gas can at her feet and a match in her hand. Her face, illuminated by the growing flames, wore a serene smile. "If I can't have you, no one will," Sarah called out, her voice unnaturally calm amidst the chaos. I screamed for help as the fire spread rapidly through the house. The heat was intense, the smoke thick and choking. Somehow I managed to climb onto the roof, gasping for air. Sirens wailed in the distance, but would they arrive in time? Sarah stood watching, seemingly entranced by the inferno she had created. As I teetered on the edge of the roof, coughing and dizzy from the smoke, I saw Sarah's expression change. For a moment, the madness in her eyes cleared, replaced by horror at what she'd done. She ran towards the house, screaming my name. The fire department arrived just as the roof began to collapse. They managed to get me down, but Sarah had disappeared into the burning building. They found her unconscious inside, overcome by smoke, as she'd apparently tried to reach me. In the aftermath, as I sat wrapped in a shock blanket watching the smoldering remains of the house, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief at my narrow escape, pity for the troubled soul that Sarah was, and lingering fear, would I ever feel safe again? Sarah survived, but was committed to a high-security psychiatric facility. I've moved to a new city, started therapy, and am slowly rebuilding my life. But sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, imagining Sarah standing over my bed. And every time I meet someone new, I can't help but wonder, what secrets are they hiding? What obsessions lurk behind their smile? I never thought much about Jake's locked bedroom door at first. We'd been roommates for 6 months, and he seemed like a decent guy, quiet, kept to himself, but always paid rent on time. I respected his privacy, even if it did seem a bit odd. But as weeks turned into months, I couldn't shake this nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. Jake would disappear for days at a time, returning with a haunted look in his eyes. He'd rush straight to his room, that telltale click of the lock echoing through our apartment. One night, as I was settling in to binge-watch my favorite show, I heard it, a muffled thump from Jake's room. I paused, my hand hovering over the remote. Jake had left hours ago, mentioning something about visiting family. Another thump, followed by what sounded like scratching. My heart began to race. Was someone in there? Had Jake been hiding a pet all this time? I approached his door, pressing my ear against the cool wood. The scratching intensified, accompanied by a low, guttural sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. This was no pet. My mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. I knew I shouldn't, but curiosity and fear battled within me. Before I could talk myself out of it, I was on my knees, fumbling with a paperclip, trying to pick the lock. The scratching grew more frantic, as if whatever was inside knew I was there. With shaking hands, I finally heard the satisfying click of the lock giving way. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I might find. Slowly, I turned the handle and pushed the door open. Nothing could have prepared me for what I saw next. The stench hit me first, a nauseating mix of copper and decay that made my stomach lurch. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I froze in horror. The walls were covered in newspaper clippings, each detailing gruesome murders from the past year. Red string connected them in a twisted web, leading to a corkboard filled with photos of people I didn't recognize. But it was the center of the room that made my blood run cold. A large metal cage stood there, and inside, God, I still have nightmares about it. A figure huddled in the corner, emaciated and barely recognizable as human. Its eyes, wild and feral, locked onto mine. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. This couldn't be real. Jake, my quiet, unassuming roommate, was keeping someone captive? The person in the cage let out a low moan, reaching a bony hand through the bars. Panic seized me. I had to do something. Call someone. But as I turned to run, I collided with a solid mass. Jake stood in the doorway, his eyes cold and calculating. "I see you've met my latest project," he said, his voice eerily calm. I opened my mouth to scream, but Jake was faster. His hand clamped over my face, a damp cloth pressed against my nose and mouth. The world began to spin as a sickly sweet smell filled my senses. My last conscious thought was the realization that I was about to become Jake's next project. I awoke to the feeling of cold metal against my skin. My head throbbed, and as I tried to move, I realized with growing terror that I was shackled to a chair. The room was different, smaller, with concrete walls and a single flickering bulb overhead. Jake sat across from me, meticulously cleaning what looked like surgical tools. "You know," he said without looking up, "I always knew you were too curious for your own good, but I never thought you'd actually break into my room." I struggled against my restraints, my voice hoarse as I pleaded, "Jake, please, whatever this is, we can fix it. Just let me go, and I won't tell anyone." He laughed, a chilling sound devoid of any warmth. "Oh, we're way past that now. You see, I have a special interest in human behavior under extreme circumstances. How far can the human mind and body be pushed before they break?" My blood ran cold as the implications of his words sank in. The missing persons reports, the murders, it all made horrifying sense now. Jake stood, approaching me with a scalpel in hand. "Don't worry," he said, his eyes gleaming with a mad light. "You'll be contributing to groundbreaking research. Isn't that exciting?" I screamed, thrashing against my bonds as the cold blade touched my skin. But I knew it was useless. No one could hear me in this soundproofed hell. As the first cut burned across my arm, I realized with sickening clarity that this was only the beginning of my nightmare. Days blurred together in a haze of pain and terror. Jake's experiments grew increasingly sadistic, pushing the limits of human endurance. He meticulously documented every scream, every plea for mercy, his face a mask of cold scientific curiosity. In moments of lucidity, I thought of the person I'd seen in the cage. Were they still alive? Had they endured the same torments? The guilt of not acting sooner gnawed at me, almost as painful as Jake's ministrations. One day, as Jake prepared for another session, a glimmer of hope appeared. He'd left a small knife just within reach, probably another sick test. With every ounce of strength I had left, I managed to grasp it, concealing it as he approached. "You've been quite resilient," Jake mused, checking his notes. "But I wonder how you'll react to—" I didn't let him finish. With a primal scream, I lunged forward, driving the knife into his thigh. Jake howled in pain and surprise, stumbling backward. It was enough for me to wrench free from my loosened restraints. Adrenaline surged through me as I tackled Jake, wrestling for control. We crashed into his table of instruments, a cacophony of metal clattering to the floor. In the chaos, I managed to grab a heavy wrench. I didn't think, I just acted. The wrench connected with Jake's head with a sickening thud. Once, twice, 3 times, until he lay still, blood pooling beneath him. Panting and shaking, I stared at Jake's motionless form. Was it over? Had I just killed a man? The realization of what I'd done began to sink in, but I knew I couldn't afford to break down. Not yet. I had to get out of here. With trembling hands, I searched Jake's pockets, finding a set of keys. I stumbled out of the torture room, my legs weak from days of confinement. The hallway led to a larger area, some kind of abandoned warehouse. As I made my way through the building, I heard a faint sound. Following it, I found myself face to face with rows of cages, each containing a person in various states of despair. Jake's other victims. The sight nearly brought me to my knees. I moved as quickly as I could, unlocking cages and helping those who could walk. Some were too far gone, their minds shattered by Jake's cruelty. The guilt of leaving them behind tore at my heart, but I knew time was of the essence. We emerged into the night air, the cool breeze a shock after so long in captivity. In the distance, I could see city lights. Freedom was within reach. As sirens wailed in the distance, someone must have called the police. I collapsed onto the grass. The nightmare was over, but I knew the scars, both physical and mental, would remain. In the days that followed, as I recounted my story to disbelieving detectives, I learned the full extent of Jake's crimes. He'd been operating for years, leaving a trail of broken lives in his wake. The man I'd seen in his room that first night, he hadn't survived. They tell me I'm a hero for ending Jake's reign of terror, but I don't feel like one. Every night, I'm back in that room, reliving the horrors. The locked door in my mind remains stubbornly shut, hiding memories too painful to face. I know that one day I'll have to confront what happened, but for now, I'm just grateful to be alive, carrying the weight of survival and the hope that in time, healing will come. I never believed in ghosts until I moved into that cursed apartment. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to save money with a roommate in the big city. The day I arrived, the air felt thick, almost oppressive. My new roommate, Sarah, greeted me with a forced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. As we lugged my boxes up the creaky stairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, the flickering fluorescent lights casting eerie shadows. When we finally reached our door, I noticed strange scratches around the lock. Inside, the apartment was spacious but felt wrong somehow. The previous tenants had left in a hurry, leaving behind old furniture and a lingering smell of musty decay. As I unpacked, my belongings kept disappearing, only to reappear in odd places. I brushed it off as moving stress. That night, I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. The walls seemed to whisper, and I could have sworn I heard footsteps in the hallway. When I got up to check, the corridor was empty, but a chill ran down my spine. I chalked it up to an overactive imagination, but little did I know, this was just the beginning of a nightmare that would consume our lives. If only I had listened to my gut instinct and run while I still could. The first week in our new apartment was unsettling, to say the least. Objects would mysteriously move when we weren't looking. I'd place my keys on the coffee table, only to find them in the bathroom sink minutes later. Sarah's makeup would rearrange itself overnight, and her clothes would end up scattered across the floor, despite her meticulous nature. The whispers grew louder, becoming impossible to ignore. At first, they were indistinct murmurs, like a radio playing in another room. But soon they formed words, pleading, angry, desperate words that made my skin crawl. "Help me," they'd say, or sometimes, "Get out." Cold spots appeared randomly throughout the apartment. One moment, I'd be comfortably watching TV, and the next I'd be shivering as if standing in a walk-in freezer. These icy pockets would appear and disappear without warning, often accompanied by a musty, decaying smell. Sarah and I tried to rationalize these events. Maybe the building had poor insulation, or perhaps the plumbing was faulty. But deep down, we knew something was terribly wrong. We'd exchange worried glances when the lights flickered, or when we'd hear unexplained banging from inside the walls. One night, I woke up to find a shadowy figure looming over my bed. Its form was hazy, like smoke given shape, with glowing red eyes that bore into my soul. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. When I blinked, it vanished, leaving me drenched in cold sweat and questioning my sanity. We needed answers, and we needed them fast. Little did we know, the truth would be far more terrifying than we could have imagined. Desperate for answers, Sarah and I began digging into the apartment's history. We started by asking our neighbors, but they'd avert their eyes and hurry inside whenever we approached. Finally, Mrs. Greenberg from across the hall took pity on us. With trembling hands, she invited us in for tea. "It's about time someone told you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. 6 months ago, a young woman lived in your apartment. Emily was her name. Sweet girl, always smiling until she wasn't. Mrs. Greenberg went on to explain that Emily had become increasingly paranoid, claiming someone was watching her, following her. The police found her body in the bathtub, wrists slashed. They ruled it a suicide, but Mrs. Greenberg wasn't convinced. Armed with this information, we dove deeper. Old newspaper articles revealed a pattern of mysterious deaths in our building going back decades. Suicides, accidents, disappearances, all centered around our apartment. The final piece of the puzzle came from the building's former superintendent. We tracked him down at a nearby nursing home. His eyes widened with fear when we mentioned our address. "That place is cursed," he croaked. "Built on an old burial ground. The original owner made a deal with something dark. It feeds on fear, on pain. It won't stop until it's satisfied." As we left the nursing home, a bone-chilling realization set in. We weren't just dealing with a restless spirit. We were living in a trap set by something ancient and malevolent, and it was hungry. Armed with the terrifying truth, Sarah and I returned to our apartment, determined to pack up and leave. But the entity had other plans. As soon as we stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind us, locks clicking into place of their own accord. The temperature plummeted, our breath visible in the suddenly frigid air. The lights flickered wildly before plunging us into darkness. In the pitch black, I heard Sarah scream. I fumbled for my phone, activating the flashlight just in time to see her being dragged across the floor by an invisible force. I lunged for her, managing to grab her hand. It felt like trying to pull against a rushing river. The floorboards creaked and groaned, and to my horror, began to splinter. Dark, writhing shapes emerged from the cracks, reaching for us with wispy tendrils. Suddenly, Sarah was wrenched from my grasp. I heard a sickening thud, followed by silence. My flashlight beam revealed her crumpled form in the corner, unconscious or worse. Before I could reach her, I felt icy fingers wrap around my throat. I was lifted off my feet, gasping for air. The entity materialized before me, a swirling mass of darkness with those same glowing red eyes I'd seen before. Its voice echoed in my mind, a cacophony of all the tortured souls it had claimed. "Your fear is exquisite," it hissed. "Your pain will feed me for eternity." As my vision began to fade, I realized with horror that this might be the end. But a small part of me refused to give up. If I was going down, I'd go down fighting. With the last of my strength, I kicked out at the entity. To my surprise, my foot connected with something solid. The grip on my throat loosened, and I fell to the floor, gasping. A crazy idea formed in my oxygen-deprived brain. This thing fed on fear. So what if I refused to be afraid? I struggled to my feet, facing the swirling darkness. "You don't scare me," I lied, my voice shaking. "You're nothing but a bully, preying on the vulnerable. Not anymore." The entity shrieked, a sound like nails on a chalkboard. It lunged at me, but I stood my ground, forcing myself to stare into those hellish eyes. "Get out!" I screamed. "This is our home now. You have no power here." To my amazement, the darkness began to recede. The temperature rose, and I heard Sarah groan behind me. Emboldened, I pressed on, shouting every defiant thought I could muster. The entity writhed and twisted, shrinking in on itself. With a final ear-splitting howl, it imploded, leaving behind nothing but a faint smell of sulfur. Silence fell. Sarah stumbled to my side, and we clung to each other, scarcely believing what had just happened. In the days that followed, the apartment felt different. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, replaced by a sense of peace. We learned that facing our fears head-on had somehow broken the entity's hold on this place. We still live here, believe it or not. Sometimes on quiet nights, I think I hear a faint whisper. But now, it sounds more like a thank you than a threat.